welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. We have Antonio Sacre here, and we're talking about storytelling. And we were talking about stories about his grandma and his interesting lineage, which is both um, your first generation. Would you say first generation from your Cuban side, American, and then you also have an Irish American side? So you
Yeah.
have many, you're balancing three separate cultures, and I wanted to hear a little bit about what that was like for you.
It's interesting. So it's yeah, my father's family, they left Cuba. My dad was in his 20s, my grandmother was however old she was, and they mostly settled in Miami. My mother's family, it was her grandparents that came from Ireland, and they came when a lot of Irish people were leaving Ireland and settling in Boston.
Hmm.
So those are the two traditions. When my parents met in Boston, we ended up living in Delaware. So I kind of do feel like three different cultures, right? It's
Yeah.
the Cuban, straight up Cuban. Nobody spoke English when I was younger. All of us first generation are completely bilingual in Spanish and English, but
Mm,
all of the older people, none of them spoke English except for my dad, and he was the only one that moved out of Miami.
right.
So that was interesting. And then my mom's family, most of them still are within a few miles of each other in the
Yeah.
Boston area. And that's a very interesting, it's a huge family, five uncles and aunts, 70 cousins. It's a massive family. And so I grew up in Delaware. So I grew up as this, in my Cuban family, I was for sure, my mom is, white. I was the whitest person in the family. And in my mom's Boston family, I was the most, my two brothers and I were the most exotic, we were so dark in the summer from all the, pre sunscreen and all that
Yeah.
stuff. So it was, I was always in the middle and never in fully in any one.
Yes.
Um, so that's one thing that was uncomfortable. And my dad tells a story. He said, "Mijo, it's amazing that you are the only one making a living as a storyteller in our family because you are like the 10th best storyteller in our family." It's so true. And it's funny, like it's kind of an insult, but it's also kind of a beautiful compliment because I
Yeah.
I can identify, and my family would very clearly say, "Yup, Tio Tito, Tia Maria, Abuela, Uncle Tom, Uncle Pat." Those are the storytellers.
Right.
So I had this great benefit of like observing and watching these
Yeah.
master storytellers telling stories. So in some ways, the Irish tradition and the Cuban tradition of just sitting around and telling stories to each other is just part of baked into my upbringing, and so, but in terms of the specificity of language, it's interesting. I'm sure that there are many examples of words that don't translate from Chinese into English and vice versa, or jokes from Spanish to English or English to Spanish. My kids love knock knock jokes, and they don't really translate into Spanish. So when my
Right.
dad tries to say, "Why is that funny?" It doesn't translate.
Right.
So yeah, so that's part of it, and this is interesting what you were saying. Like you said, I imagine my experience was the same as yours. Chinese American first generation Washington is literally the opposite. Yet we have some very similar things. And as a storyteller, I believe that when somebody dives into the specificity of their own story, they get at the universal.
Mm,
So yes, your grandmother's not Cuban and didn't come here, but your grandma, my grandmother didn't live in nine houses, but there's so many, Chinese food is totally different from Cuban food. But I'm sure if I started telling some stories about how my grandmother would prepare this special meal at, right before Christmas, or how she made, tamales, or how she did a certain thing, tamales and dumplings, are they similar? Are they different? Like, what is that like? And so when I described my grandmother's kitchen and her pressure cooker with a little black hat that was dancing on top of it and the
mm,
steam coming out of it, maybe not every culture cooks with a pressure cooker, but we cook with, what do we cook with, right? Woks, or we cook on stoves, or we cook on, grills, or we all eat, we all talk. And so my job has been just really, really trying to find what was specifically memorable and exciting. And sometimes it's hard to uncover that. I do have an image of both as a writer, you're just pulling coal out from the mountain and you're just trying to find that diamond. It's the polishing and the polishing. So, in the 1,000 meals that I had at my grandmother's house, how do I distill it into one 10-minute story? That's
mm.
the craft behind it.
Yeah.
because you've probably had 100 meals with your, whoever, right? And so how do we find what makes that special and worth sharing?
Yeah.
It's kind of been the work that I have done. And then, frankly, at the beginning of my career, there was such a need for children to hear somebody who is bicultural speaking in both languages. And so had the joy and the almost obligation to tell Cuban and Spanish stories to inspire kids who are bilingual like me. Listen, this is important for you to share these languages and these.
Mm, yes. Like, yeah, yeah, one thing that when I was talking to these gals, irrespective of their culture, or you're Native American or, Chinese or whatever, the stories that I hear, if I hear the common threads among talking to different people of different cultures and I can relate to, it's the assimilation. You have to fit into a certain culture that is so different than the culture that you have at home, the culture when you go to school, when I present to other people in my, corporate life.
Yeah.
There's like a different face that you have to put on that's different than the face that you have at home. So you have this kind of like, managing these two faces of yourself in this cultural dialogue. And just like you were probably, when I always find I love seeing as children that are bilingual, they talk to their your grandma in Spanish, and you talk to your dad in Spanish, and then you're like speaking, Italian to your your grandma, and you're like, I always love when I see that. It's just like, wow, that is just crazy. Like, here's this kid talking three different languages to their to their mini UN family. It's just
Right, right.
phenomenal. But it's like this amount of assimilation that you have to go through, and how someone will never understand that there are these two faces, right? That you have to like flip back and forth. I can't even do it with my hands.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
how do you manage these two sides of yourself that are very, very different? I mean, perhaps because you have like a Western genesis for both of your traditions, it's a little bit easier. But the Chinese culture and the American culture are very, very different in some ways and very, very similar in some ways. So they're similar in the sense that, it's very, great academic and excelling academically and performing and accomplishment oriented. That's exactly the same in each culture. But for the Chinese culture, there are things like modesty, humility, being quiet and respectful, toning everything down, not being noticed and invisible. And all of those things were so, like, those are keys to success in being a Chinese person. And listen to authority. Come to the American culture. Guess what? You get run over. You will get run
Right.
over and over again. And so I'm wondering if you had those similar kinds of assimilation issues or
Yeah.
challenges.
Sure. There's one thing I'll say, and both my children are bilingual. They speak Spanish, but they prefer English, and there's no house that I can send them to in our immediate family where they're going to be immersed in Spanish the way that I was, right?
Yeah.
So part of assimilating just happens naturally, right?
Yeah.
It's just possible. And hopefully their kids will speak Spanish, but their grandfather, my dad is perfectly bilingual, but he has a really thick accent.
Right.
And I'm perfectly bilingual with no accent in either's one. And you know what I mean? So like that part of assimilation is it's just natural. It happens. But it's interesting you said that. So, you have to remember where you're at and you have to try to figure it out. My grandmother was very, very Cuban but from a very specific generation, right? So where no man was allowed to help with the dishes or help with the cooking, wasn't a, and so it was, whereas my mom's, it's, second, third generation Irish. If you didn't help with the cooking, or you wouldn't eat, right? And if you didn't help with the cleaning, you would be a big disaster. So I was so used to cooking and cleaning in my mother's Irish family. And then I would just take my plate to the sink and start washing it. And I would get yelled at by my Cuban grandmother. So
Yeah.
then I would not help with the dishes in Boston. And then I would get yelled at by my auntie. So part of it is just trying to figure that out. But what I think where the opportunity is how do you take, however you judge it, the best from both,
Hmm.
right? So I lived in Chicago for many years, and now I live in Los Angeles, where there's plenty of people from Mexico and Central America. Living on the East Coast, I didn't run into those people. I ran into Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Caribbeans and Dominicans and Jamaicans, but never Central American. Now it's different, but when I was younger, that was not the
Hmm.
case. so I started to learn about Mexico. And so what is amazing about Mexico? Tons of things, but the thing that struck me when I was first learning about the culture was how they celebrate the Day of the Dead, which
Mm,
happens exactly at Halloween. I love Halloween. You teach your kids to go out and beg for candy. Mexicans at the exact same time teach their kids to honor their ancestors and talk to their ancestors.
mm-hmm.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm not Mexican, but how great would it be to also get the candy and talk about our ancestors?
Mm,
So, how can you still have these amazing qualities of being modest and fitting in with the culture and have your own radio show? Like this
mm-hmm.
is like you're like look at so how do we take the best out of both and learn from all of it? We have this wonderful opportunity through technology to learn. I'm listening to music from all over the world with my kids. That didn't exist when I was younger.
Yeah.
The four radio stations we had. So now we read a book about Pakistan and we can hear Pakistani music streaming free the next minute, and that's
Right.
really kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I want, there's part of it is exposure and part of it is living it and part of it is really like, okay, let's choose. Let's choose what really works. Because the machismo and the treating women badly and the Cuban thing that I learned, that doesn't work. That
Yeah.
I didn't, and I don't want to be that person. So these are things I had to let go of. And there's some pain in that as well. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, in this new world where everyone is focused on diversity, equality, and inclusion, DEI stuff, it's been interesting just seeing the evolution of it. And I think it is an evolution. We're still in the baby steps. Where I see the very beginning parts is understanding the history of like these are my here's like the historical background. People have mistreated women, mistreated African American people, have mistreated all immigrants. It's just and and those stories are real stories, and they put a lot of people in shame. Like people who are not of a person of color feels like they're in a lot of shame and guilt as a result of these stories, which I think is the opposite of maybe what stories should be. I don't know. There's a problem that I see in the way that some of these DEI stories are told. I think if it's a personal story where, when I was younger, people used to, make the like Chinese look at me, dirty knee, so this kind of things. And it didn't affect me, but it did affect me at some level, at some probably very deep level, but my day in, day out life was not affected. But if it had, those are kind of the stories that I think are important to share because they help someone like develop empathy and compassion for another person. But I'm wondering how we can and improve our stories so that it's just sharing a personal experience versus shaming or guilting anyone and making them feel bad. And I see the DEI stuff making a lot of progress in the sense that they're sharing stories, but they're kind of maybe historical summations without a personality to them, and they hurt other people.
Yeah.
In the weird way, they hurt white people and making them
Yeah.
feel bad about being white and feeling
Yeah.
privilege. Like I've had people, younger men who are like, "I'm sorry, it's because I'm so privileged and white. I shouldn't even be talking." And I was like, how did this arrive? Like, this is not a good outcome either. I don't think this is what this was all about. So, in the
Right.
next segment, I wanted to get your perspective because you're at UCLA Story
Yeah.
Lab School. You've been hearing people share your stories and to hear maybe what we can learn from sharing stories and how we can tell stories in a way that brings us together
Yeah.
versus separates us. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing about your experience as the melting all these different cultures together. So thank you. We've been talking to Antonio Sacre, and who is the author of Worlds. My name is Cool, and just created an MP3 World's Second Best Dad. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, CJ. Thank you.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show and would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.